This is Newsroom. Hello and welcome from Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm Sam Marshall. The show is live and broadcast from our studios in Auckland Park. We're also streaming live on YouTube with the entire show available on our YouTube channel. Doctors Without Borders joins us in studio to give us an update on some of the camps that have been set up for foreign nationals during these xenophobic attacks. We also look at the Ekurhuleni Metropolitan Council, who has closed temporary camps used to accommodate refugees who have been displaced. And cybercrime is one of the fastest growing crimes in the world. We find out why. But first, let's get the day's news with Anindoma.
Well, good morning, I'm Anindo Mal. Let's just have a look at the stories making headlines today. A preliminary report into yesterday's Metro Rail train collision is expected to be issued today. The railway safety regulator has been concluding a report on the collision that left one person dead and 240 injured. The deadly crash saw two trains colliding at Denver Station in the southeast of Johannesburg early yesterday morning. Meanwhile, PRASA has encouraged passengers injured in the crash to register for compensation at the Pretoria Station or Park Station this morning. A memorial service will be held today for the Mozambican who was stabbed to death in Alexandra. Emmanuel Sithole was killed on the 19th of April in an attempted robbery. Johannesburg Mayor Parks Tau and Graça Machel are expected to attend his memorial service in Johannesburg. The Mozambican's remains are expected to be repatriated in a joint effort by the City of Johannesburg, the Home Affairs Department and the Mozambican Embassy. President Jacob Zuma is expected to face questions over the recent attacks on foreign nationals in the country. This when heads of state from the Southern African Development Community gather in Harare today. Adopting a regional strategy on a roadmap for industrialization is the only item on the agenda, but neighboring states say they want an explanation on the violence. The United Nations says rescuers are racing against time in Nepal. Government officials have indicated that the death toll from last week's earthquake could rise to 10,000. This as rescue teams battle logistic challenges. A team from South Africa's aid relief organisation, Gift of the Givers, left yesterday to join international organisations to assist in the massive relief operations.
Yesterday it was a very emergency trip. We had to look for the best possible flight. So the connection was through Singapore. They landed 1 a.m. this morning, our time there. They'll touch down soon now. And the whole issue is to make sure that the team is met there with the Nepalese authorities that we have communicated with. We've got some Nepalese doctors with us, so the language issue will be fine. We've worked through obviously government, DIRCO, Indian government, Nepalese government, just to try and see which is the best possible way to get in.
The Nigerian army has rescued nearly 300 girls and women, but says the 200 girls who were abducted in Chibok are not among them. The schoolgirls' kidnapping by Boko Haram caused international outcry last year. The army says the 200 girls and 93 women who had rescued yesterday were being held in the Sambisa forest in the northeast. In the United States, hundreds of Baltimore protesters are in a standoff with police. Crowds have taken to the streets throwing stones and bricks at police and National Guards. The protests have been sparked by the death of Freddie Gray, a black man who died in police custody. The riots have been described to be the worst riots since the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. And Manny Pacquiao says he is 100% ready for the richest fight in history. This after Floyd Mayweather and Pacquiao participated in rallies attended by fans in Las Vegas. The showdown between the two top fighters is expected to smash pay-per-view records, both in terms of buys and revenue. The long-awaited showdown between Floyd Mayweather and Pacquiao will take place on Saturday, the 2nd of May. It will be the richest fight in history, with the two protagonists set to split in the region of $200 million. Xenophobic attacks around South Africa left thousands of foreigners. Well, Sam will link to that story. Remember, you can find all of those stories on our Newsroom Facebook page. Just search for Newsroom. You can also follow us on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Annie. Now, the xenophobic attacks around South Africa left thousands of foreigners displaced, but humanitarian organizations quickly stepped in to set up camps. This week, a number of camps across the country will close as foreigners return to their home countries. But for many others, going home is not an option. Joining us from our Durban studio is Doctors Without Borders representative, Musa Ndlovu. Musa, thank you very much. He's joining us to give us an update on the situation. Give us an update very quickly on the situation, Musa. We know, as we stated in the intro, that many of the camps are closing, but we do know that there are foreign nationals that will not be returning to their respective countries, and many of them, in many ways, still fear for their safety.
Thank you very much for having me in the studio. It is very true. Some of the camps will be closing. Phoenix is already closed, which initially has been housing around 2,500 people. It was closed yesterday, and now the number has been reduced of the people who are there. They are foreign nationals, the people who are coming from very troubled countries like DRC, Burundi, who will be left stranded because there is no proper plan in terms of moving forward. The reintegration process is not very clear up to now where they will be going, and they fear for their life as well in going back to the communities. Since this xenophobic attack started, about 1,000 of the foreign nationals has been taken to their countries, and just yesterday, about 22 buses departed to Malawi, which leaves the camp, the Phoenix camp, with only Congolese, about 700 Congolese and Burundians that right now are looking for the alternatives.
What is the work that Doctors Without Borders is doing within these camps at the moment?
Doctors Without Borders, the Medicine Sans Frontiers, is providing medical assistance as well as looking at the advocacy issue. We are looking at water and sanitation. But all what we do, we are doing it in collaboration with the Department of Health as well as the disaster management and health environment of the city. So that is what we are focusing on, and we are very much concerned about the well-being of the people who are housed in the camps.
What are some of those challenges that those that are left behind in the camps are still facing?
They are facing quite a number of challenges because as I mentioned, that about 700 of the refugees really doesn't have alternatives because they cannot go back to their countries. There is war taking place. Also, with the reintegration process, it's not very clear, which raise fear for them because they do not feel safe to go back to the communities. So right now, they are stuck in between, not knowing what to do.
When we started this conversation, we were saying that some of the camps have been closed down. For those that are still operational, Musa, do you have a sense of how long they'll still stay in operation?
It's not easy to say for how long is it going to be operational, but the government is trying to work with the ambassadors of the foreign nationals in ensuring that repatriation is done. It's a voluntary repatriation, but yes, there are those people who feel that they do not want to go back. And we do not really know for how long is it going to be there. But what we say as MSF is that the life in camps is really not conducive for people to live in there. We'll appreciate if this could be a fast track and the camps come to an end and people are reintegrated if that's what is going to happen. And, you know, in a humane way, and the acceptance level is high with the communities. where they will be reintegrated to.
The Malawian government officials have called for their people to board 22 buses, which is now return home. What, from your sense, or if any, are the conditions that they will be returning to?
Personally, I cannot really tell exactly because the situation in their countries is something that I'm not familiar with. But from what they say, if we have discussions, that there is an element of joblessness when going back to their countries, and they were able to get themselves job here in South Africa, which will cause life to be very difficult, taking them to school and also being able to maintain their families, because they will be they won't be having work that they'll be doing when they go back home.
We talked about reintegration and the sense that there's not a clear plan. What, from your sense, would some of the foreign nationals like to see?
From what they say, they would like to see a situation where they are in a safe condition. They are in the safe place where they will never get attacks. And also they want to be in a place where they will be well treated as human beings. So for now, there is a huge element of fear that they are really not accepted in the communities.
Going forward, one final question to you, Musa. Going forward, what is MSF going to be doing in the next couple of days, weeks, as more camps close? And also, from an operational perspective, will you then move to other camps that are still operational, or are you set in one particular area?
MSF is working in all the camps. So as Phoenix camp has been closed, we'll still be working with the Isipingo and Chatsworth camp. And with the ones that has been repatriated, more especially Malawians, there is MSF on that country as well, who is also looking at what kind of support that could be provided when they arrive in their country.
So we're going to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us. That's Musa Ndlovu, who's talking on behalf of Doctors Without Borders, giving a sense for what's happening in the camps that are still open. Over the past weekend, we've seen camps across the country in various sectors close. We also, a little bit later, said to talk to a member from Ukreleni, where we've seen some of their camps close. Now, in a world driven by technology, privacy is often a concern when dealing with online content and social media in both a personal and business environment. Cybercrime is one of the fastest growing crimes in the world, and the results of such cases can be devastating, resulting in the loss of money, clients and reputation. Joining me in studio now is the Managing Director of Alexander Forbes, Gary Dombo. Gary, thank you very much for joining me here in Newsroom, and thank you very much for taking the time out.
Good morning, Sammy, and thank you for inviting me.
Cybercrime. When we think cybercrime, we think high-tech movies, we think James Bond, but what we often don't think of is that it's a real part of our lives and it's a real threat to our safety.
Absolutely, and it has been there for a long time, but I think to a large extent it has evolved and has become even more relevant due to evolving legislation that is coming into play. I think any organization that uses the web, for example, any organization with a website is potentially exposed to cybercrime. And to a large extent, you're almost exposed as much as a publisher, because the information that you put on there is obviously going out to the public, and you are actually exposed to the public.
There's some interesting things we mentioned now in our intro: loss of money, clients and reputation. The reputation one I can understand.
Sure.
Talk to me about the other two, loss of money and clients. We do know that there's a lot of scams on the internet.
Sure. The biggest risk is around privacy, and privacy of personal information that clients do have. And for an organization, you can have a lot of data on your system. You can have a lot of data at your disposal. And a lot of that information pertains to individuals and to organizations and is between basically you and your clients. But again, because of the web and the internet interventions, there can be breaches in terms of the security around that. So essentially, the exposure that sits with an organization is around a breach of that security, around the information that you have, which essentially relates between yourself and your clients. And this is where you then turn around and say, can you quantify your potential exposure? What happens if you sued and you actually have to defend yourself? There are legal costs that you have to pay. You can either pass that risk, which is essentially what insurance is all about, or you can absorb that risk yourself, which means you retain that exposure. A lot of organizations are now passing that exposure because you don't know the extent of that exposure, because the internet is exploding. So essentially the key challenge is to say, have you been able to identify what your potential exposure is, especially if you are exposed, particularly in terms of the internet. We talk about property assets, but we don't talk about informational assets.
Yeah.
And informational assets is one of the key properties that an organization can have. It may not be the physical assets that you see, but certainly it is the intellectual property that you sit with, and that alone is huge exposure for organizations.
So as a layman, would cyber insurance work exactly the same way normal insurance would work?
And unfortunately not. The current liability covers that are on the market do not address cyber risks as they are addressed in terms of the first party and third party risks that actually emanate as far as cyber insurance is concerned. So yes, one would need that kind of cover. To a large extent, Sam, what has happened is the exposures have always been there. The only difference is that there have not been laws to actually try and protect and ensure that clients are protected. Now you see pending legislation around POPI, for example, does present that kind of an exposure, where personal information and protection of personal information becomes critical. It has been there in the United States. 46 out of 50 of the states in the United States actually have a cyber legislation that talks to, for example, relating to the likes of POPI. So for us, the advent of that legislation does call for the need for even greater a need to ensure that we are as secure in terms of cyber security as possible.
We're talking about almost 70% of South African businesses that are significantly unprepared for cyber liability risks. It says to me that nearly 70% of South African businesses are uneducated when it comes to the risk of cyber crime. How would that, with all of that being said, and you can comment on that too, Gary, but how does that affect me as I'm not a business, I'm an individual, I might fall under the reputation stakes, maybe loss of money if I'm swindled, but not necessarily clients. We saw recently naked pictures of a woman doing the round on social media. Just talk to me about the two, business and the individual person.
You have to give consent in terms of your information being passed on to other third parties. So if as an organization we've got your information, we need to be careful what we use your information for. You give us authority in terms of how to use that information. You basically say you will use this information for insurance purposes, for example. Beyond that, you have not given us that authority. It's critical then that we use the information for what you have actually asked us to use that information. If we then use the information for other purposes without your consent, obviously then we are breaching your own personal rights. In the United States, there was a case, for example, where a celebrity as pictures were used in an advertisement, and there were damages that followed. And there have been successful cases of that nature where without the consent of the third party, you cannot use their personal information.
Very quickly, Gary, where do we rank in the rest of the world? If this is a new service, are we saying that there's an increase in cybercrime in South Africa and where we've got to put legislation or whatever it is in place right now to deal with it before there's a boom in cybercrime?
Cybercrime to us right now is as certain as tax, or it's as certain as death. It is there and is there to stay. And because as we increase in terms of usage of the internet, as we increase in terms of cyber usage, as every organization gets on the web system, we are potentially exposed. And it becomes critical, therefore, to actually say to yourself, what are the exposures that sit with you as an entity, and also what are the exposures that sit with you as an individual? Because chances are you may infringe on somebody's personal rights.
Gary, you've given us a lot to think of. Gary Dombo, who is from Alexander Forbes, sharing his insight and expertise around cyber crime. And we welcome your comments, of course, at SABC Newsroom. Let's take a look at your tweets. Please remember to send us your views on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. It comes from Kufu, who says, "Oh my gosh, OMG, wish you all a speedy recovery." Hashtag train crash survivors. We know that a train in the Denver area at the Denver Railway plowed into the back of a stationary train. Nasiba Madiba says, first it was the hashtag Metro bus and now it's hashtag Metro Rail. What's actually going on with our municipal public transport? We can't forget those two buses on Jan Smuts, I think, that collided into each other. Katiwe says, hashtag train crash. Why is it key to emphasize female train driver? What's the agenda of all involved in route planning? A speedy recovery to the injured. Then Eugene Watson is condolences to the family who lost a loved one and a speedy recovery to all those injured in the hashtag Denver train crash. Now let's take a look at the front pages from around the globe, starting in Europe with the Wall Street Journal. Reports that President Obama called on the nation to do some soul-searching in the wake of the violence that erupted in Baltimore, while asserting there are limits on what he or any president can do to change the system. We'll have a chat to Sherwin Bryce-Peace, who is our USA correspondent, and we'll unpack that story a little bit later for you. In Canada, the international New York Times, residents of Kathmandu living in 10 camps after Nepal's powerful earthquake said on that their biggest worry was a lack of safe drinking water, even as they endured the latest pelting of rain. In the USA, the Miami Herald reports that the same-sex marriage debate divided the court yesterday in what seemed to be a protracted and at times passionate argument that might have tilted over slightly towards marriage equality. Let's take a look at what's happening around the country today. We start in Johannesburg. Czech fugitive Radovan Kritcher and 7 others are expected to appear in court today in connection with a plot to murder a forensic investigator and a policeman. Then in Pretoria, where the North Gauteng High Court is expected to hear an application by a prostate cancer patient to allow him to end his life. He's arguing he will die an undignified death. And in the Western Cape High Court, a man found guilty of killing his ex-client's lover and allegedly cut the victim's heart out and ate part of it. Expected to be sentenced today. That's where we leave Newsroom for now. We take an ad break. You don't go anywhere.
Hola, my gents. There are more than 22,000 voting stations in South Africa, but there's only one for you. That's the one where you registered. Your local station. Vote local, cause local is lekker. Finish and klaar.
We live in a digital era, and the number of Africans with mobile phones is rapidly increasing.
Twitter use is predominantly being done on smartphones. This is a very African phenomenon.
Here, there are constantly new innovative ways to make the internet more affordable. With that, we're seeing protests against governments proposing methods to limit access. On Network, we give you information about all of this. We also have new computers, games, and robots.
Join Siphumelele Zondi on Network every Sunday at 19:30 CAT.
Didier Drogba, a footballer from Ivory Coast, was named as the third most influential celebrity in Africa.
Where I saw him display, he's a very nice player. He always make an impact.
Drogba donated his $5 million endorsement fee to the construction of a hospital in Abidjan.
Well, there are some lesser-known football stars in the continent that you haven't met.
Really?
And are deserving of more attention.
I think we will do better.
The Journal, every Saturday at 1:30 on SABC News.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsroom. Thank you for choosing to join us now. The riot hit Baltimore in the United States has seen another night of violence. Police had to fire smoke bomb and pepper pelt at protesters who defied a citywide curfew that went into effect late last night. This after shops were looted and buildings burned to the ground in violence that erupted following the funeral of a 25-year-old black man who died after suffering injuries in police custody. Joining us now to give us the latest is SABC correspondent Sherwin Bryce Peace. Sherwin, thank you for joining us. I know it's quite early there by you. Give us the latest on the Baltimore riots.
Well, your introduction, touches on some of it. It wasn't quite what we saw on Monday night in terms of the protesters and the police engagement on the streets on Tuesday. What you had was a number of protesters on the streets again, but you also had a very huge law enforcement contingent, thousands of local police, Baltimore police officers, thousands of regional police officers, and then you had the National Guard deployed in terms of that state of emergency which was declared on Monday. That's essentially the army with live ammunition and guns at the ready on the streets, really to enforce a curfew which we are in effect currently at the moment, a curfew that went into effect at 10 p.m. last night. It will be lifted at 5 a.m. We're at about 3:30 a.m. in the morning here. And really what you saw were a few hundred agitators remaining on the streets last night after 10 p.m. And so the question was really, how was the police going to enforce that? Were we going to see more violence? Were we going to see live ammunition used? And we saw none of that. What you had were those smoke bangs, if you want to call them, really loud bangs that let off blasts of smoke that really confused people and dispersed them very quickly. So we didn't see the levels of agitation, what President Obama the day earlier referred to as criminals, as thugs on the streets that were hijacking what was a peaceful protest, what had been peaceful protests on the streets of Baltimore in mourning and recognizing the injustices that might have been portrayed in the Freddie Gray death while in police custody.
So for the benefit of this conversation and just to enlighten a lot of our viewers, who was Freddie Gray and why is his story so important, Sherwin?
Well, Freddie Gray was a black man, a 25-year-old man that was 10 days ago spotted by police on the streets of Baltimore. They made eye contact. He ran for it. I mean, clearly he was up to something. He was arrested. We only see video of part of that arrest. He was put into a police van. There is a police investigation undergoing now. He died, in hospital a few days later from a severed spine. You see video of police carrying him into a police van with his legs limp below, screaming for help. Apparently, the investigation will reveal all of this. And I think what you saw on the streets of Baltimore was a frustration at the lack of transparency, with days having gone by from the police in this regard. 6 police officers, I can tell you, have been suspended. But Freddie Gray, really, to answer your question, Sam Marshall, is the Eric Garner, is the Michael Brown, is a number of other names who will go nameless today, because there are so many instances where black men in this country have died at the hands of police brutality. And so Freddie Gray is a microcosm or an example of a broader question that the president was really trying to address yesterday, the socio-economic ills that face black minority communities in the United States, and how police then engage those communities. He called for a soul search that need to happen in the United States. You know, if you want to form a quick identikit of the people on the streets that were throwing stones and burning buildings and looting liquor stores, these are people who probably didn't have a good education, probably didn't have a great job to go to that day, who, these are not Harvard graduates that are throwing stones. These are people that probably didn't have a father growing up. Father probably went to jail, probably did drugs. Mother probably working 3 jobs. So how do you then address those socioeconomic issues so that you don't have a cycle of violence and police brutality and this engagement on the streets repeating itself? There's a vicious cycle going on in the United States. The president says it's been happening for decades. And so Freddie Gray represents a long-standing issue in the United States that the president now believes policy, government, Congress needs to step in and address.
Sure, and I've been indicated to wrap this, but I just want to get a sense from you very, very quickly. We've seen in Ferguson, Missouri, the escalation of that public violence. What is what are we going to see over the next couple of days? We've seen harrowing pictures coming out of Baltimore, police cars being destroyed, looting shops. You talked about those smoke bombs. Are we going to see this dissipating soon, or are we expecting weeks of riots? Quickly, sir.
Very quickly, are we going to see more black men dying at the hands of police officers while in police custody? What is the investigation into Freddie Gray's death going to reveal? Those are going to be indicators as to whether you see this happen again. If you see no more black people dying in police custody, I'm sure these kinds of protests will go away.
The interview time has been extended. I just want to talk to you very quickly about President Barack Obama and the comments that he made and how that is either going to resolve a tension-filled issue or is going to add fuel to fire, because he did talk about policies. He is talking about some form of legislation. He's talking about, in many ways, decades of ingrained violence within these kind of communities. How does he now begin to look like the beacon in the storm and make sure that whatever he is trying to articulate gets carried through to on the ground?
I can't, foresee how the president will be able to get any new policies through Congress. I mean, it's a divided Congress, as you well know. The Republicans control the House and the Senate, and the White House has the pen of veto. But I think the broader question here is what the American Congress and the American people really want to see. What do members of Congress that directly elect their representatives to the House want to see? Remember, this is a president that is essentially, for all intents and purposes, on his way out. So what you saw at the White House yesterday was a president that really didn't have any, strings. He wasn't being puppeteered by anyone. He literally was speaking from his heart, I thought. And this is not going to be only an issue for this president. This might be something for a future president. Remember, we're kicking off a 2016 presidential campaign, and maybe it will become part of the future election narrative. And maybe this is something you will see candidates promising in terms of how they can effect change. It might not just be something for President Obama. Having said that, he has instituted a task team led by the Department of Justice. It was Eric Holder. It's now Loretta Lynch, the first black American woman to lead the Department of Justice. And they've come up with a number of recommendations for local police officers, like the cameras that you will wear on your shoulder. What sort of community engagement and relationships are being built between police officers and their local communities? And then you're going to have to look at broad economic questions. How do we make sure that people are getting a good education and a good job so that the cycle of violence doesn't repeat itself? And that's not going to be a job just for the White House. This is very much a job that will go down to those communities, down to the state level, and where those elected officials are going to have to come to the party.
Sure, and you're going to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us from the U.S., our SABC correspondent Sherwin Bryce Peace, sharing his insights on the riots that's been happening and escalating in Baltimore after a 25-year-old black man died of his injuries while in police custody. Now, U.S. President Barack Obama says the nation needs to do some soul-searching if the underlying tensions between African-American communities and the police are to be fundamentally addressed. He was speaking at the White House a day after hundreds rioted on the streets of Baltimore following the funeral of a black man who died in police custody.
Scenes of chaos, looting and wanton destruction. A day later, the National Guard bring order to the streets. But a cycle the president believes will take more than sending in the cavalry.
In those environments, if we think that we're just going to send the police to do the dirty work of containing the problems that arise there without, as a nation and as a society, saying what can we do to change those communities, to help lift up those communities and give those kids opportunity, then we're not going to solve this problem.
Making his first remarks after the death of Freddie Gray 10 days ago, he called for a rethink on education, criminal justice and economic development, particularly in poor communities.
I think there are police departments that have to do some soul searching. I think there's some communities that have to do some soul searching. But I think we as a country have to do some soul searching. This is not new. It's been going on for decades. And without making any excuses for criminal activities that take place in this community, what we also know is that if you have impoverished communities that have been stripped away of opportunity, where children are born into abject poverty, they've got parents often because of substance abuse problems or incarceration or lack of education themselves can't do right by their kids. If it's more likely that those kids end up in jail or dead than that they go to college.
Police announced 235 arrests, 31 of those juveniles, while a curfew remains in place from 10 p.m. to 5 p.m. for the rest of the week. Sherman Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Let's just take a look at your tweets. Please remember to send us your views on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. This comes from Body Rock Stan. It says, I'm so glad I don't live in America. Too much civil rights being violated. Hashtag proud Texan. Hashtag Baltimore riots. Hashtag Baltimore. Roberto Martinez says, I guess those who were suddenly concerned about hashtag Baltimore riots can go back to not caring about police killing young innocent black men. Mutuka Fred says, hashtag justice for Freddie Gray, hashtag Baltimore riots, hashtag one Baltimore, hashtag Black Lives Matter. Hell on Wheels, the people in Baltimore learned nothing from Ferguson. Your riots and looting cost your neighbors their jobs and livelihoods. One from @PHUCT. I have mixed views on the Baltimore riots, but one cool thing is how many people are talking about it. Those are some of your comments. And today's picture of the day comes from Shekina Knows. This is why minorities are angry, and it's hashtag Baltimore riots. Today's tweet of the day is on Baltimore riots. It comes from Ryan Armstrong. It says, crime is crime, regardless the color of our skin. Right is right and wrong is wrong. That's hashtag Baltimore riots. Now let's take a look at what's happening on our Newsroom Facebook page today. The Railway Safety Regulator, RSR, is expected to issue a preliminary report on Wednesday into a collision between two trains at Denver Station in the southeast of Johannesburg yesterday. United States President Barack Obama has called on the nation to do some soul searching if the underlying tensions between African American communities and the police are to be fundamentally addressed. The recent spate of attacks on foreign nationals in South Africa is likely to be discussed at the one-day meeting of the Southern African Development Community Extraordinary Summit, which starts in Harare today. You can find all of these stories and more on our Newsroom Facebook page or visit our SABC website at www.sabc.co.za.
One thing to say we are prepared to die for freedom. It's another to know that you have taken a course of action, which means almost certainly that you will die in the course of that struggle.
The idea of meth getting in the hands of the enemy was unthought of.
And in warfare, well, somebody has got to die.
That goal was outstanding.
Made so much dust that I couldn't see and I hit a stone and we had a puncture.
Catch all these and more every day on Sports Live at 8:30 p.m. on the SABC News channel.
Didier Drogba, a footballer from Ivory Coast, was named as the third most influential celebrity in Africa.
Where I saw him display, he's a very nice player. He always make an impact
Drogba donated his $5 million endorsement fee to the construction of a hospital in Abidjan.
Well, there are some lesser-known football stars in the continent that you haven't met.
Really?
And are deserving of more attention.
I think we will do better.
The Journal, every Saturday at 1:30 on SABC News.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsroom on SABC News. Let's just have a look at the stories making headlines today. A preliminary report into yesterday's Metro Rail train collision is expected to be issued today. The railway safety regulator has been conducting a report on the collision that left 1 person dead and 240 injured. The deadly crash saw trains colliding at Denver Station in the southeast of Johannesburg. PRASA has encouraged passengers injured in the crash to register for compensation at the Pretoria Station or Park Station this morning. A memorial service will be held today for the Mozambican who was stabbed to death in Alexandra. Emmanuel Sithole was killed on the 19th of April in an attempted robbery. Johannesburg Mayor Parks Tau and Graça Michel are expected to attend his service in Johannesburg. President Jacob Zuma is expected to face questions over the recent attacks on foreign nationals in the country. This when heads of state from the Southern African Development Community gather in Harare today. Adopting a roadmap for industrialization is the only item on the agenda, but neighboring states say they want an explanation on the violence. Remember, you can find all of those stories on our Newsroom Facebook page. Just search for Newsroom. You can also follow us on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. Sam, back to you.
Thanks, Anine. And a little bit later, we will be crossing to Harare, Zimbabwe, to cover that story for you coming out of the SADC summit. Now, South Africa has been facing a problem of poor performance in maths and physical science in the past years. In response, the Department of Basic Education has introduced various strategies in an attempt to curb this problem. However, the 2013 and last year's matric results indicated that those strategies were not effective enough. As a result, the Department of Basic Education has introduced the 1+4 teachers model, which seeks to improve senior phase performance in maths and physics. Today we are joined in studio by the Chief Director of Maths and Science and Technology in the Department of Basic Education, Tsaliki Tlhabane. Sir, thank you very much for joining us here on Newsroom. Let's start with the obvious question. What is the 1+4 teachers model?
Thank you very much, Sam, for having me on your show. The 1+4 teacher model is an intervention that was conceptualized to address, as you indicated, the poor performance in mathematics, particularly in the senior phase. The senior phase, we talk about grade 7, 8, and 9. However, you correctly put it that the problems are across the system. So the 1+4 is a methodology that we employ to turn the system around 1 week at a time. The 1 and the 4, as you see, 1+4 is a mathematical expression to indicate that we have 5 days in a week. So we set 1 day aside to prepare teachers, to capacitate them, prepare them to go and deliver the curriculum for the remaining 4 days. And we are targeting the grade 8 and 9 educators at the moment because of the poor performance, in fact, the disappointing performance that the minister announced last year when she released the ANA results, where it was reflected that in the grade 9, our learners performed a 10.8% average in mathematics, which constituted a crisis, and that this was an admission that we are a nation in crisis, and the minister then directed that we need to respond urgently and come up with a radical plan to ensure that we reverse this. Now, what is critical for us to understand is that this 1 day, which may be a Monday as we had proposed, but it can be any other day in the week, we remove teachers out of the classroom. They gather in clusters across the country, clusters of schools of about 5 to 10 schools, and teachers share ideas, they share strategies, they share methodologies on how to teach the topic that's supposed to be handled that particular week. So we say the methods that we have employed and the models that we implemented in the past, they've demonstrated very little success. That is why we said then we have to be very radical and say we are going to give teachers content in small doses, only sufficient for a week. And we say once they master that, they must go and deliver it to the learners. The following week, then they come back. We plan for the coming week, give them content, strategies, methods of assessment, and they go and implement this. And we say we are turning the system 1 week at a time. The model in its design sets aside about 23 days of contact session. This is massive in relation to what we have done in the past. That the training models that we have implemented in the past, we would expose teachers to content for a period of 5 days and give them the content for the whole year. And we say they go and implement. It hasn't worked. The maximum number of days that we have ever given is when we expose teachers to training of about 10 days. So 23 days is revolutionary, is unseen. We haven't done anything like this again.
Mr. Tlhabane, many will argue that when you're giving teachers content in 5 days to implement across the year, that a lot of those teachers struggle with basic competence and maths themselves. This 1+4, will you be able to, for lack of a better description, be able to weed out those teachers that are weak in maths and science and don't have the ability to translate maths to students?
That is precisely the purpose of 1+4. And that is why we say then teachers must meet in small groups, enough to promote interaction. Because you'll understand that the workshops that we usually run and that we have run in the past, you would put about 50 to 60 to 100 teachers in a room, and you then transfer this knowledge to them.
And it gets lost.
Then it gets lost because the group is too big and it doesn't promote interaction. So we believe that when you have about 15 teachers to 20 teachers, this would create interaction amongst teachers. And we have also factored in the design of the model what you call the pre-test and the post-test, where we test the content knowledge of teachers before the intervention itself, before they engage with each other. And at some point, then we test whether what they've been exposed to, they were able to assimilate.
Talk to me about implementation in rural areas where there's known to be shortages. How do we get around that?
This is a real problem in the country. What we do is we have subject specialists who are our maths specialists who are office-based, who also take the responsibilities of ensuring that every school in the country is supported. And the dynamics that you are mentioning, there are a whole lot of them. But we say, as I'm sitting here with you right now, there are learners who are inside of the classrooms, who are supposed to be taught. Our district directors, our circuit managers are on the ground and managing this to ensure that all the vacancies that are there in the system are filled, and that we recruit teachers who get into the rural areas. The department is coming up with a strategy of coming with incentives to get teachers to be willing to work in the rural areas, as you have indicated. Because all of us, we want to work in spaces where there's development and all that. So that is a real problem, but the department has another strategy of promoting acceptance of teachers to work in rural areas.
Very quickly, we've seen the advance of smart technology, paperless environments in classrooms. We've seen independent suppliers like Pearson's, for example, who does all the training for teachers related to smart boards. In the Free State, EduSci Math has been involved in rolling out maths and science principles there. What is the role of independent contributors to this new plan, 1+4?
The minister says education is a societal issue, and that the players in this space are not only confined to the employees of the department, that we have many NGOs, universities, independent contributors who come in with innovative solutions to try to solve the problems that we are facing as a sector. And ICT has a huge role to play moving into the future. And the 1+4 is actually a part of a framework that we developed that has about 27 deliverables, 1+4 being one of them. And in the short term, we are coming up with this 1+4 where we're running these workshops. We've got medium-term goals, we've got long-term strategies. And ICT forms part of what you call the medium term, where we will then, through an Operation Pakisa that is driven through the presidency, we will be able to come big time and roll out ICT into our schools. Use various platforms like rolling out end-user devices, using the broadcast solution, using internet, using WhatsApp, and various solutions that can assist us to deliver education better and much more effectively.
So we're going to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining me. That's the Chief Director of Maths, Science and Technology of the Department of Basic Education, Siliki Tlhabane, sharing his insight on a new strategy to address our poor performance around maths and physical science. Now let's take a look at what you say on the social media platforms. Please remember to send us your views on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. This comes from Seep, I think. It says, "Man, I love at Manny Pacquiao now. He doesn't have to win for me to know the grace of God works through him." And by the way, that pay is split between them 60-40. Manny Pacquiao will walk around away with about $80 million. Can you believe it? Craig Hardy, "You're not beating Mayweather on points in Vegas, will always win on slip decision. What's your views?" That's at May and Pac. And of course, Mayweather is expected to walk away with $120 million for rocking up for that fight. An 8-hour drive tomorrow. That's all home for the hashtag Maypac fight, though. Yes, it's been billed the biggest fight in our sports history. That comes from KW. Those are your comments. We always welcome them. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. Newsroom is broadcast live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, every weekday morning between 9 and 10 a.m. The show repeats at 2 in the afternoon with a rebroadcast at 5 a.m. the following day. We also stream live on YouTube at that time with the show available on demand on our YouTube channel. This is SABC News. You've been watching the Newsroom. We love it in the morning. Say no to xenophobia.